This is Studio 809.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Outdoors with Hiking Bob podcast. I'm your host, Hiking Bob Falcone, and you can find me on my website at hikingbob.com, which has links to my social media, my photography website, my newspaper columns at the Colorado Springs Independent, all the other podcasts we've done, everything there at hikingbob.com. And also, if you have a suggestion or a comment or a question, and I really love suggestions for people to have on the podcast or topics to cover, you can also do that at the contact me link on my website, and also sign up for my newsletter there, which comes out about once a week. Some weeks like this coming one where I'm going to be on a camping trip, and there may not be a newsletter this week, but there'll be one after that. So in any case, hikingbob.com, and I'd love to hear from you. Today we have a guest who is an author and researcher who's written some pretty cool books about things that aren't so cool that happen in some of our national parks. It's Randi Minetor, and the book I have in my hand is Death in Rocky Mountain National Park, but also she's written about a bunch of other national parks. Randi, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Oh, thank you, Bob. I'm delighted to be here.
So I'm reading. I got an email about your books, and I'm looking at them, and they cover national parks I've been to. I'm thinking of one about Zion, but you've written books about all these different national parks and unfortunate things that have happened. And you said, which one would you like? And I said, well, Rocky Mountain National Park is up the road from where I'm at, and send me that one. And I'm reading it, and I'm about halfway through it, and what I'm impressed with is the detail. You really have to do some research, because some of these things you talk about go back 100 and some odd years. They go back a long ways. When you research some of these, two questions. How did you even find out about some of these incidents that occurred so long ago? And then how did you research and find the information to even write about them?
It's a very tricky process. One would think that the national park would open their files to me, but in all honesty, particularly with Rocky Mountain, they essentially said, we have no time for you. And most of the national parks don't necessarily want to emphasize this side of visiting a park. So that's kind of usually a closed avenue. So I start with the vast archives of newspapers that are now online that go back well into the 1800s. And I go through, particularly starting with the local papers and then going out a little further to the Associated Press and the things that become much bigger stories. And I comb them. I search on death, Rocky Mountain National Park, and things pop up, and I create my own list of people. So there may be some that I missed that are not well known outside of the park itself. But for the most part, the ones that get a great deal of coverage, there's a lot to say about them, and sometimes the searches themselves are very, very extensive and are well covered in the press. So that's the first thing. And once I've got a list, then there's all kinds of places you can search for information, everywhere from findagrave.com, where you might find some really interesting obituaries, to sending FOIA requests to the local police station, or tracking down the search and rescue people. In a couple of the parks, it feels like there's a conspiracy of people trying to keep me from getting this information. That I'll go to the police department. I'll say, "Oh, we don't have any of that," and the search and rescue people won't even return an email. So I end up using the avenues that are available through the government, like a Freedom of Information request. It's quite the process. And then, of course, there's the question of interviewing people. Well, all my subjects are dead, and while some families are happy to tell the story again, most of them are not. And even when I query them, when I track them down on social media and so on, most of them never respond to me. But a few do, and they make terrific stories.
Yeah, specifically here in Colorado, the search and rescue information is almost impossible to crack. Search and rescue organizations don't share it with anybody. We've got some pretty good sunshine laws here in Colorado, but it seems that search and rescue information is, and I'm a journalist here in Colorado, and we get a brief news release from the sheriff if we're lucky, and not much else. And I've had search and rescue people on the podcast, and they'll talk about their job in general, but they'll never talk about anything in any great detail for whatever reason. And I'm looking at your Amazon page with your books. You have Death in Zion, Death in Glacier, Rocky Mountain, Acadia on Katahdin, which is from what I've heard, that's a pretty rough hike. Mount Washington, the Everglades. I'm making sure I get the list right here.
Yep, that's all of them.
That's all of them. What was it that spurred you on to say this would be a cool topic to write about? What was there any one thing, or did you get it like me? Like, I'm an ex-first responder, so I'm interested in this kind of stuff. But what made you start writing these books?
Well, to start, my husband and I took our honeymoon as a driving vacation through the West, through Mount Rushmore and the Badlands and Yellowstone and Grand Teton and Dinosaur, and then, coming back. And I just fell head over heels in love with the national parks. Up to that point, I'd never been out West. So it was really an eye-opener. And over time, between that and my love of birding, it became more and more important to me to spend more time outdoors. So I managed to make it my career. And I pitched a book to this particular publisher at the Globe Pequot Press, and not only did they buy it, but they turned it into a 9-book series. So all of a sudden, I was this fairly well-known author among them. So when the National Park Service Centennial came up, or was coming up, and I happened to be at Book Expo with all of these editors and my agent, we heard about all of these. We heard about their plans for the Centennial and the books they would be bringing out. And one of the things was they wanted to do some more death books. They had done Death in Yellowstone. It's been wildly successful. And they thought, gee, maybe there's other parks where people die. So I was standing there essentially, and my agent just, took me by the arm and said, "Randy will write those for you," and we were off to the races. After the first one was Death in Glacier, which has some of the most dramatic stories in the entire Park Service, particularly the very famous Night of the Grizzlies in 1967. When 2 girls were eaten by 2 different grizzly bears on the same night, 20 miles apart.
Yeah.
It's a crazy, crazy thing to have happened. But, you start with that and then expand out to the people who fall into cracks in glaciers and freeze to death in 3 hours, and people who decide they want to break a record for climbing a specific mountain, but they want to do it in the winter. People who just over and over again try to do very, very hard things, and it doesn't work out for them. So that became a real fascination. And after Glacier, Zion was a no-brainer. That was obviously the next place to go, and so on through the series.
I haven't read the one about Zion, but I'm curious because I've been there and hiked up there. Any of them involve Angel's Landing?
Oh, yes.
I thought so.
Oh, yeah. There are 7 known deaths on Angel's Landing. One of them was a suicide, but the rest are people who either, didn't make it off of that. For people listening, if you don't know what Angel's Landing is, it's a very rugged hike, although it's gorgeous. You're hiking through a beautiful canyon called Refrigerator Canyon. You go up this thing with 21 switchbacks called Walter's Wiggles, and you get to a place called Scouts Lookout. And from there, there's this thin fin of rock that you're going to go across to get to the final lookout. And the fin it's not very long, but it's terrifying. It's about 6 feet wide. There's a chain for you to hold on to, and on either side, it drops 2,000 feet. So if you don't make it across this, you're not going home. And a lot of people were not afraid of heights, just go skipping across this thing. But some people honestly get halfway across and they freeze in terror. And then a ranger has to come and sort of peel you off of this. And the hard thing is, in the 6 feet, there's traffic going both ways. So there's people coming down as you're going up. It's a very scary thing. I got the scouts lookout and said, nope, I'm not doing that. I know myself too well. And most people don't do it. But for those who do, 7 of them did not make it home.
I'm actually surprised the number is actually that small, considering how many people go there. And they've now put in a reservation system to hike into Angel's Landing. I've done it a number of times. And last time I did it, I should say twice, not a number of times. But last time I did it with a couple of friends. We went up Walter's Wiggles and got to Scouts Lookout, and they looked at it and go, "Oh no, we're not doing that." And I said, "I'll see you in half an hour." I went up and came back, and I describe it to people. Like I said, you're hanging on to a chain that's bolted into a rock. If it's like anything else in the government, it was done by the lowest bidder, so you're hoping that it hangs on. But it's a pretty impressive place. And the views, like you said, when you look down the valley, are just absolutely gorgeous, but certainly not for everybody to do. If you're the least bit scared of heights and slippery things and thin rocks and hanging onto something, I don't recommend doing it, because it's like I said, you'll have to have somebody come and peel you off of there, which would hold everything up and just make a mess of all kinds of stuff.
Exactly. Yeah.
I'm reading a book about Rocky Mountain National Park. Like I said, it's the one you were nice enough to send me. It's very interesting reading going back. It hits going even back into the 1800s.
Mm-hmm.
And we'll start off by saying technology was obviously much different. The clothing, at the time, it was the thickest, heaviest stuff you could wear. We didn't have lighter weight stuff that we have now. Modes of transportation were much different. Communications were non-existent. Obviously, everything was done face-to-face for the most part. But it seemed like with some of the same problems we have that you had then that we have now still exist. I'm going to the subtitle of your book, Accidents and Foolhardiness on the Continental Divide. A lot of these things that happened in your book about Rocky Mountain National Park are people getting in way over their heads, either unprepared, untrained, just should not have been there to begin with. Now, in some cases, accidents just happen. That is still occurring, even though we have better equipment, better communications, much better ways of relaying to people what to expect and what to do. I think that also makes people think they can do anything. Mm-hmm. Is that a common theme through all of your books about people who unfortunately die in some of these national parks? Is it a common theme that they should not have been there to begin with?
Yes, it absolutely is. One of the things when I go out and speak on this topic, one of the things that really stands out is people who are just out of their element. That, maybe they're really strong hikers in Minnesota, but you get out to a Colorado 14er and you really have no earthly idea what you're going to face. The fact that the weather at the bottom of the mountain is not the same as the weather at the top. The fact that there are thunderstorms almost every day with lightning strikes around 3 p.m. through spring, summer, and fall at the top of Long's Peak. Things that, people just don't encounter in the Great Plains or in the eastern states, that you just don't realize how much harder it's going to be, that it's July, but you're still going to be hiking across ice. And you need that ice axe. Oh my God. So these kinds of things, just, people don't put it together, and then they find themselves, 12,000 feet up and realize that they haven't brought enough clothing, they haven't brought the right equipment. Long's Peak is officially not a technical climb, but technical gear will help. So, it makes sense to have some of that in your head. It's also people who don't have the experience in general to be taking on something that hard. There are easier 14ers if you want to do that. There's some you can drive to the top, but Long's Peak isn't like that. And for them to, people who just don't realize that they need skills they just don't have. Unfortunately, there was one story just a few years ago while I was working on this book about a young man who set out, despite rangers telling him he was ill-equipped, despite people on the way down telling him it's blizzarding up there, you shouldn't go. He went ahead and tried to climb Long's Peak in his sweats. I mean, didn't have the right clothing, didn't have any gear with him, like packed a sandwich and took off. And nothing seemed to daunt him, and he never came home.
Right.
And they found his body several months later.
I believe I remember that case, and it wasn't that long ago when that happened, and it generated quite a bit of publicity here and searching around here. You're right about people coming out here. Pikes Peak, which I'm looking at right out my window here in Colorado Springs, is one that you can drive up to. The other one is used to be called Mount Evans. They've since now changed it to Mount Blue Sky, has a road to it. And this is just side information, people listening. That road is going to be closed till Memorial Day of 26 because they're redoing a lot of the road work up there. And it's interesting, Pikes Peak is the big attraction out here in Colorado, and it sits right outside of Colorado Springs. So you can't be anywhere without there's this big mountain here. And just to get to your point about people's misconceptions, although it's not a national park, is I get emails from people who say, I want to hike up Pikes Peak because I want to do a 14er. And it takes me a lot to tell them this is really a bad idea if this is your first 14er because A, it's 13 miles one way, 8,000 feet of elevation gain. And if you're not used to doing this, there's a whole lot of much easier, and I say easier in quotes, 14ers. Easy is a relative term when it comes to 14ers, but there's so many that are much easier to do than Pikes Peak. And it takes me a while to say, do another one and do another one and do another one before you tackle this one that's 26 miles round trip. And by the way, if you don't schedule it right, you can get stuck on the peak because nobody can drive up there to get you. But that goes back to what you're saying about people just not being aware of what it requires. And it's amazing that in this day and age, with the amount of easily accessible public information,
yes,
I'm looking at my computer and they can go to my website or a lot of other websites and find out what it takes, that you still have people do that. I get it in the 1800s when we didn't have that information. And if you didn't stop by the ranger station and talk to an expert, you could easily be fooled into it. It just amazes me that we still have that issue where people just are not aware of what it takes to go out and do some of these high altitude, rugged. And Long's Peak, it's amazing that's not considered a technical climb. It is a technical climb by any stretch of the imagination.
Yeah, and that's the thing, that there is so much information out there. There's really no reason that anyone should be surprised at what they find. But there are people who are just overconfident in their own skills and don't do the research. So then the national parks have another safeguard. They have the rangers. And if a ranger says to you, I wouldn't do that hike if I were you, or this is not the day to climb this mountain, or you personally don't have, you've planned something that is much too difficult for your skill set. And they will tell you that. They are there to keep you from getting hurt or killed. If at that point you ignore what the ranger says and you go anyway, that's on you. At that point, there's a story out of Glacier National Park of a young man who decided to take an 8-day trek across Glacier National Park, starting in a very difficult area, and he had before he left, he cached all of his supplies along the way so that at various parking lots, so he would be able to pick up things as he went. He was supposed to go with his wife. His wife had a family emergency and couldn't go, so he decided to go alone. And he filed his plan with the Rangers, and the Rangers said, "Oh no, you can't do this. We're not giving you the permit for this. This is not okay." And he went anyway, and he didn't make it through his first day.
Ugh.
And it was 2 years before they actually found any remnants of his body or his belongings, that another hiker happened across some pieces of fabric and put two and two together.
Wow.
But he never made it to his first cache. And luckily he had filed a plan, so they knew more or less where to look for him, but they still couldn't find him.
Was
So
he way off? I'm sorry. Was he way off track? Is that why they couldn't find him,
he was
he
no
wandered
longer
off?
on the trail. Either he had lost the trail or he had become disoriented for some
Ah,
reason. And why he didn't make it through the day is anyone's guess. Um, Probably it looks like maybe he fell and broke his neck.
oh wow.
Yeah, something like that.
In the book, and with most of these places being in the West, we kind of touch on that with Rocky and with Zion. A lot of these are people who fall. They're trying to climb a 14er, and it happens a lot. People slide off or don't have
Mhm.
the equipment, so they can't hang on. They need ropes and stuff, or especially in the case of Rocky, and I'm sure Glacier, they freeze to death
Mhm.
because they get caught in bad weather, which I've been snowed on Pikes Peak in August. So that weather can come at any time. But the questions I get from people, matter of fact, I had a text message today because I was out hiking yesterday. The question was, did I see any wild animals? That's not the concern, but is
Right.
are there many cases where it really is wild animals? You talked about the night of the grizzlies that goes back to the 60s, but is that really a common thing, or is that more very much the exception, like we kind of tell people it is? Or how many of your stories involve wild animal encounters?
Really very few. I mean, remarkably few. Um, there are no stories of a bear coming out of nowhere and attacking somebody. That's not what they do. They're going to go sniffing around the food in your campsite or the garbage dump nearby. And then if you interrupt them, then you might have some trouble. Um, there's one mountain lion attack, and it's such a freak accident that, clearly I don't know, clearly who knows how the lion was thinking, but a little boy who ran in front of his parents on a trail, and a mountain lion came screaming through and grabbed him. The boy he didn't die of the lion attack. He actually choked on his own vomit because he was so
Oh,
scared. There's the mountain goat or bighorn sheep, maybe you would know, in I think it was Olympic National Park that attacked for some weird reason attacked somebody on a path. But that after that, it kind of trails off. Black bears are really shy of people, don't want anything to do with you. So if you make a little noise, they're going to run off. Elk, deer, moose, there are no stories that I've come across of any of those being a problem for people. The one thing that might change that is if you're hiking with your dog and your dog goes running around. Yeah, you need to keep your dog on a leash, preferably no longer than 6 feet and close to you, because the dog could end up in a confrontation with a bear or a bobcat or some other animal.
we have found out here that the elk particularly do not like dogs.
Mhm.
And they will. We've had some dog incidents in the last couple of years, and moose are not happy with dogs too. And the wildlife people will not go after an animal that harms a dog if the dog was off leash. They're going to say your
Mhm.
dog looked like prey or a threat. and that's what happens. But it's interesting to note that, and as I kind of suspected, that very few of the cases that you research in all of your books actually involve wild animals. That for the most part, they really don't want anything to do with people. People are a threat to them, so they try to stay away from them.
Now, there is one exception to this: alligators. Not a problem in Colorado, obviously, but
Yeah.
in Florida, you really honestly do want to stay away from the alligators. They're opportunistic feeders, and if your ankle passes too close to them, you may find yourself getting dragged into the water. So that's that is the one thing. But that's all through Florida and Georgia and South Carolina. So
You do have a book, Death in the Everglades, and I was wondering
yeah.
about the alligator thing. I tell a story about one time visiting the Everglades, and I'm at Merritt Island Wildlife Refuge, and
Mhm.
I see an alligator with just its eyes and his nose sticking up out of this body of water, and I'm parked on the side of the road, and I'm taking pictures of it because that's what I do, and I've got a big telephoto lens, and then the alligator goes under, and then I'm standing there, and I realize I'm really close to the edge of the water, and I don't know where that alligator is, and I should probably get
Right.
back in my car and get out of here, because I also realized, my toes are kind of close to this, and that alligator, I don't know where he is anymore, so I kind of got out of there. Um, in your stories, well, let me ask you one other question about the book writing itself: is how long does it take you to compile one of these? Is this I imagine it takes a while. There's a lot of information that's pretty detailed in here.
Yeah, it does. It takes all my time to gather the information. I thank goodness for the internet, although I certainly have spent some time in dusty attics of libraries, especially up in Maine, going through hard copies of newspapers and magazines. So, there is that facet of it as well, and some microfiche. But for the most part, the ability to search on somebody's name is really a spectacular advancement. But it's usually 9 months to a year that I'll
Okay.
spend on one of these books. From usually when the publisher, the Globe Pequot Press, has an interest in a specific book, it's because the park itself has expressed an interest in it. They don't want to help with it, they don't want to be part of it, but they sure do want to sell it. These books are very profitable for the parks. So, so often there is kind of a push from the publisher: how fast can you get this done? And you don't want to speed through a thing like this. The first people who are going to pick up this book are the families of the deceased. So you want to get it right.
Right.
So my agent and I work to kind of put the brakes on crazy deadlines, but it's usually about a year.
Okay. And you've done a number of those. Was there a case in all the books you've written about? Was there a specific incident that struck you as being the most surprising or the oddest or the weirdest way that somebody met their unfortunate demise in a national park? And a lot of these cases, to be fair, a lot of these, and you don't cover all these, are people who die of heart attacks and natural causes, which happens anywhere, anytime. That's not what we're looking at here. But has there ever been one that you stood out and said, that is the weirdest thing I've ever heard?
Well, there are some that are just, confluences of strange, strange things that the death itself is not that unusual, but the fact that the person was right there at that time. There's one where somebody was riding a horse, and as they were crossing a bridge, somebody in a car went by too fast and honked, and the horse spooked and leapt.
Oh, geez.
Right, and fell over the side essentially and into the rushing river. That's a person who died. There are There are the weird things where a rock happens to fall at exactly the moment that you're standing there. I mean, it's just sheer bad luck. But in all honesty, the weirdest things tend to be the murders.
Wow.
Uh,
Yeah.
yeah, in particular, the spouses who think they're going to go into some remote part of a national park and push their spouse off a cliff and then collect some huge amount of insurance money. And that to me they always get caught. Nobody gets away with that.
And one of those happened here in Rocky Mountain, not too many years ago, and it turned out that that guy had also probably had a hand in the unfortunate demise of his previous wife before
Oh,
that. Yeah, and
yeah.
that's actually been a mini series made about that. Um, let's talk about that for a minute. People worry about crime, and I think my personal experience and opinion is that fear of crime in our national parks is probably overblown a little bit. But
Yes.
have there been that many um, homicides that have occurred in our national parks? Have there really been that many?
No, there have not, which is really quite remarkable. And they're almost always somebody who knows the other person. Occasionally there are a couple of, stories about a drifter who, asked for a ride in a van, and the next thing you know, he's got the van and the original driver is dead. There's a couple of those, but that's not the norm. It's really any of the parks that have high precipices in remote places that you can still get to by car. They've got at least one, unhappy spouse who tried to off the other one.
Okay.
And very often they succeed in killing the person, but they never collect them insurance because it's so obvious what they've done. They're in some part of the park where nobody goes, so they won't be seen. Oops, the person, the other person falls. And there's almost always a double indemnity insurance policy that was recently purchased. Like the life insurance companies don't know how that works. So yeah, those people end up in prison. There's one really famous one in Acadia, that is, like you say, that this guy offed at least one wife before he pushed this woman he had married 3 weeks before,
Mm.
off a cliff and into the ocean. And he was hoping to woo back another woman that he actually loved by having a whole bunch of money. He bought a double indemnity policy the day after they were married, so he would have collected $400,000, and he spent the rest of his life in prison.
As if the insurance companies haven't seen this before and kind of
Right.
know what's going on. And the cops haven't seen this before, and all these investigators. There's nothing new under the sun. They've all seen this stuff before. So the fact that people think they can get away with it is is just amazing. It's like they've seen all this. They know what's going on. It may take them a while to put all the pieces together to successfully prosecute, but they've seen all these things happen. Um,
Right.
so I mean, our national parks, as far as being a victim of a crime, are pretty safe places. Considering the millions of people who go there, they're pretty safe places. You talked about people falling off cliffs. Are you and of course one of the places that comes to mind with that is the Grand Canyon,
Oh,
um,
yes.
and they've had a number of deaths this year from
Yes.
people falling off cliffs, but a lot of them have also been drownings in the Colorado River. They've had a few of those. They had a massive flood that went through there a couple of weeks ago that caused at least one person to die. Um, is that, and you haven't done a book on Grand Canyon, is that one that's coming up for you, or is that something you're looking at?
No, there is a wonderful book already written on the Grand Canyon called Over the Edge, which is the bestseller of all of the death books, mainly because the Grand Canyon, everything that happens there is so dramatic.
Yeah.
And these two guys are terrific researchers and also have feet on the ground there. So, yeah, it's a very popular book. More power to them.
Okay.
Um, but there's no question. Grand Canyon is, if any of the national parks can be called deadly, that's the one. And I can tell you from having been there and watching people start down Bright Angel Trail in high heels, having no idea. And of course, they turn right back once they figure out what it's going to be like. But, seeing just unprepared people just, wander off on this thing as if they're not going to go down 5,000 feet and then have to come back up. I mean, it's a very treacherous place if you don't know what you're doing. Otherwise, if you're going to stand on the edge and just look at the canyon, great, you're not going to have any trouble at all. But if you're going to hike there, you really have to do the research and know what you need.
It's interesting with Grand Canyon. We'll just touch on that for a second. Is that how many people? And I have that book you were talking about. How many people died either taking a picture and weren't paying attention and walked off the edge, or how many people were having their picture taken and somebody said, take one more step back or something and fell off the edge. Just complete lack of situational awareness in Grand Canyon. And I'm sure that accounts for a lot of other things. We talked about that. Rocky Mountain, people trying to do Long's Peak and just not being aware of what they're getting into. Zion, people trying to do Bright Angel.
Angel's Landing.
Angel's Landing. Sorry,
yeah.
We just talked about Bright Angel.
Right.
And not realizing that you got to hang on to these chains and make it up there.
Right.
Some of the other places that, and they may not be as familiar to my listeners because we're out west, you're more out east, is like Acadia National Park. And I know that's kind of a rugged area in Maine. I've never been to that park. It's on my long list of places I want to go visit. Much closer to sea level, so we're not talking 14,000 foot peaks or anything like that. No. But has that been kind of the same thing? Has it been falls and slips and exposure, or what is that? Is that a common theme for all of these? Is that common?
The difference in Acadia, to answer your question, yes, slips and falls and being in the wrong place at the right time are themes that go through all of the parks. But in Acadia, you have the ocean. And in particular, you have the ocean and the rocky coast of Maine. So there's only one little beach in Acadia. The rest of it is all rock. And one of the things that happens is if there's a hurricane down south, the hurricane itself may never make it all the way up to Bar Harbor, Maine, but the force of the storm surge will. So people will gather on the coast to watch the waves. These huge waves will come in and they'll dash against the rocks and break, and everybody says, "Woo!" And isn't this fun? Well, this makes the rangers crazy because they get huge crowds of people that they can't control. And people, at Acadia, you can walk out onto big rock slabs along there, and people will do that so that they can, get wet like they're at Niagara Falls, and they fall in. A wave just sweeps them right off the edge there and throws them in the water. And there's one young girl, I think she was 9 years old, who was drowned. When three people were whisked off of the edge and thrown into the water, and boats who saw this happen came from all over the place to get close to try to help, and the Coast Guard finally rescued the two adults, but the child unfortunately didn't make it. And that's one of the difficult things, that people just think this is fun and have no idea the force of the ocean. So,
and I imagine there at Acadia too, it's not just the water, obviously, and drowning in it, but as you said, it's very rocky. So it's getting beat on the rocks as the water is pushing you back and forth. It's not like being at a beach in New Jersey where I used to live, where the worst you could do is end up on some sand someplace.
Right.
That you're gonna get beat up by these big rocks that the water's just gonna be pushing you against.
That's it exactly. Yes, and the force of the water will pull you out to sea, but you do get that back and forth. The other thing is that down right along the water's edge, some of these rocky cliffs have caves that have been hollowed out over time. And going down into these caves at low tide is a lot of fun, but you really have to watch when high tide is coming in. And one poor guy unfortunately got trapped in one of these caves and drowned. Just couldn't push back out against these waves that were holding him in. So, you get weird things like that are different from pretty much all of the other national parks in Acadia.
I see one of your books is about Mount Katahdin, which is it's in Maine, right? That's also in Maine.
Baxter State Park in Maine, it's the
Okay.
terminus of the Appalachian Trail.
And that's where I was kind of going with that. That's the end of the Appalachian Trail. I'm not familiar with it other than that it is the edge of the Appalachian Trail. And we just had a guest on here a couple of weeks ago who had just hiked, like a lot of other people have, hiked the Appalachian Trail from one end to the other and end up there. What makes Katahdin such a dangerous or a place where a lot of, worthy enough that you had to write a book about it?
Well, this is the interesting thing. No Appalachian Trail hiker has died on Katahdin.
Ah,
That's not the problem. Because when you go up the route that's the Appalachian Trail, that's compared to what you've faced all the way down the other 2,200 miles, this is not that big a deal.
gotcha.
But it has a ridge called the Knife Edge, which is very much like Angel's Landing. And some people just skip across this thing and, think, it's fine. Wasn't a problem. But there are all kinds of challenges involved. If you don't stay on the trail, if you think you see a shortcut and you start down, you end up in a place where you can't go up and you can't go down. It's not a shortcut at all. And it's even cordoned off so that you don't do it. And people still think they can do it. So people get stuck there. People start up in bad weather and don't realize what that's going to mean, and they get trapped somewhere on the ledge. There are lots of each predicament's a little different, but they mostly end up with somebody trapped overnight on a ledge in a snowstorm. And while the mountain itself is not that high, it's about 5,400 feet. The predicament that you're in, if you don't have the gear to get yourself out of a place where you can't climb up or down, you're stuck there until somebody can come out and find you.
Right.
And in a couple of places, no one knew that they were there. They hadn't left a plan. They didn't tell where they were going. So, they just, after 2 or 3 days, suddenly their family says, he never came home. So we have that problem. There's also one story in which 2 rangers went out to try to find somebody in bad weather, and one of the rangers died.
Ugh.
Yeah, it's not that treacherous on a pretty day. It's not. It's just another mountain on the Appalachian Trail.
Yeah.
But if you're trying to get up there in fall, winter, early spring, you can really run into some bad stuff.
And at 4,500 feet, like you said, it's not very high, but compared to the local area, that's a pretty good amount of elevation from where
Yes.
you're at. Even though, we're sitting there going, my house here where I'm recording this at 6,300 feet. Think, oh, what's 5,400 feet? But compared to the surrounding area, that's a tall peak for that. So
Yes.
there's still a lot of elevation gain, a lot of climate change from bottom to top and stuff like that occurs. So people can get kind of, it doesn't seem like it's that high, but it is.
Yeah, and that's the thing. And it's the changeability of the weather in New England. It's the same thing on Mount Washington,
Right.
where the worst weather in the world has been recorded at the top of Mount Washington. So why the heck are you climbing it in January? It's that kind of thing that we all appreciate that there are people who love to challenge themselves. Bob, maybe you're one of those who you want to try something difficult to say you did it, but those things can also mean you're risking your life.
I'd like to think that I have my risk assessment brain working all the time. And that comes from being a first responder. Like, is this really worth doing? And is it worth doing today? And a lot of people, and I get it with a lot of people. They go out there. They have a few days. This is the only time they're going to visit this place, wherever it is. I want to experience as much as I can, and bad weather be damned. Advice from the park rangers be damned. Advice from the other hikers who've been there for years saying this is really a bad idea, and they get in this kind of trouble that these things occur. I'm looking at your book on Mount Washington. I wanted to touch on that one stories of accidents and foolhardiness on Northeast highest peak. Mount Washington's weather, from everything I've ever read about, would put anything we have here in the Rocky Mountains to shame. The winds are unbelievable. The
Yeah.
amount of snow it gets is unbelievable. Everybody says, but it's only, I don't remember how high it is. It's certainly not a 14er by any
No,
stretch,
it's
but it's like, can it be that bad? And I'm like, oh yeah, Mount Washington is horrible. Tell us a little bit about Mount Washington.
Well, the thing about Mount Washington is its position. So that you have the wind coming at it from the north and the east, and there's a I forget what they call it, a glacial cirque. It's just this big bend in the mountain, and it gathers all that wind together and pushes it up, and that's where you're hiking. So,
Oof.
even on a calm day, it's pretty breezy up there. And if it's July and it's 80 degrees at the base, at the top, it's still going to be 35 degrees and snowing. So you just have to take that into consideration as you plan your hike. Now, the great thing about Mount Washington is that the mountain clubs at some of the colleges have put these wonderful little shelters, fully enclosed little cabins, along the route up the mountain, which are stocked with food and firewood and things that you need. So if you get stuck, there's some place, if the weather changes on you and you really need to spend the night and try again in the morning, you can go into one of these and you'll be okay. The problem is that when it starts snowing, when it gets dark, if the weather takes a really bad turn, people can't find these. They get blown off the trail and they can't find these little cabins. So you end up spending the night, holed up on the ground somewhere. And a lot of people don't make that, that exposure gets them. So it's a lot to take into consideration that whether you're planning to camp or not, you have to bring camping gear just in case, which makes this a much harder hike than people realize.
And I'm going to bring this back from what you just said about the shelters and stuff on Mount Washington back to here at Rocky Mountain National Park and the book you wrote there. And there's a connection made where there were some hikers who were planning on hiking, I think, the Chasm Lake and in Rocky Mountain National Park. And they had come from back east where the shelters were like you described them, cabins with food and firewood. And they come out here and they see that there are these shelters. And goes back to, I believe, the early 1900s. So again,
Yeah,
communications being a little different. And they see on the map that there's these shelters and they're used to what they see back east and go,
exactly.
we'll be fine. So they bring food, but no cooking equipment because they feel we'll go there and there'd be firewood. And they come out here and our shelters are not the same thing. They're
Right.
barely lean-tos in most cases. So they get to these shelters, they try to get to these shelters, and they find out that there is no warmth, there is no firewood that's pre-cut, there is no food in these shelters, and they end up getting in. One of them freezes to death in the middle of a field someplace that they just end up because they, again, going back to research, and they're coming from back east where those clubs maintain better equipped shelters than we do out here. And a little bit of research, again, going back, this is the 1900s, early 1900s, where they didn't have that ability, would have found out that, no, I need to actually cut my firewood when I get there. And I need to actually have a stove to cook with because all this raw food I'm bringing, there's no way to cook it. But it's interesting that, kind of connecting how people from one part of the country go to another and expect things to stay the same
Right.
and they're not. And I think people who come from here and might go back east and go, how bad could it be? The mountain's only 5,000 feet. But like you said, where it is makes it really a miserable place to be,
Right.
and probably not the best place to go visit. The book I'm reading is really great about Rocky Mountain National Park. I actually recognize some of the more recent stories. I've been here about 33 years. So I recognize some of the more recent stories. Some of the older ones fascinate me because I'm actually thinking to myself, the 1800s and people were actually had the skill and tools to climb these peaks. So obviously they did. It's not like they just invented this last week, but amazing to hear these stories. Do you have
Imagine
any?
climbing Long's Peak in a skirt. You
We
know?
have pictures of people doing it on Pikes Peak too. Yeah, it's
Right,
like how did they do that? It's just amazing.
right.
Um, do you have any other another book in this series in the works, or have you taken a break from this, or more in the works?
Well, I don't have one right now, but we're talking about Death Valley, which
Okay,
only makes sense.
sure.
And it's, one of the things is that the park to make a book, the park has to have enough actual deaths to qualify for a book. So there's a lot of parks that none of this stuff happens. You're not going to see a Cuyahoga Valley National Park, death book when everybody's just walking by the canal. But Death Valley stands out because a lot of people die there, and most of them of the same thing, of just really underestimating what 120 degrees in July feels like and how much water you're going to need, going to and from. So there's that, but there's also in the background of that park, there's a lot of fighting over gold. So there's murder, there's mayhem, there's all kinds of crazy stuff going on. So I'm hoping that's the next one, but we'll see how that goes.
That'd be an interesting one because, like I said, it'll be easy just to assume, well, they just died of the heat, but there's a lot of history going way back
Right.
before tourism was a thing in Death Valley that I'm sure would really make a book about that interesting. Randy, we've had a great time talking about your books. I've enjoyed the heck out of the book I'm reading. Can't wait to finish it. Um, how can somebody find your books? How can they find more information about you?
Well, you can go to my website, Minetor.com, which is Minetor. These books are available on every online bookstore there is. So Amazon, and if you don't like Amazon, go anywhere else and you can order them there.
So the Barnes and Nobles and stuff like
Yep.
that, everybody will find them. Excellent.
Yep.
Randy, anything you want to tell us before we go that I may have forgotten to ask you about?
Oh, just be careful out there. Listen to rangers. Pay attention to weather and don't do anything I wouldn't do.
That's actually really good advice. I was out yesterday in one of our parks here. It's about 8,500 feet, and had some rain come through. But fortunately, I had my rain gear on, and my dog has a border collie with two coats of thick fur. He was fine. We were fine. It wasn't very cold. A little uncomfortable, but we came out of it. We're just fine. But I go out prepared. I've been doing this stuff for a long time. But
Sure.
that's good advice. Don't do anything that anybody who knows what they're doing wouldn't do, and you're probably going to be just fine.
Right.
Randy, thanks again for being on the podcast. Thanks again for sending me the book. Conversation has been wonderful, and if nothing else, I think people will just learn how to be safer by reading some of your books, and then learning about the unique situations about some of these different parks too.
Great. Thank you so much, Bob. This was delightful.
Thank you, Randy. And with that, I'll say thank you for being on the Outdoors Hiking Bob podcast. Thanks, everybody, for listening, and we'll talk to you next time.